In this video, I'm going to show you how to use the Intarsia carriage, how you can quickly test easy shapes, how to develop your pattern on square paper, and how to read a chart. I always start planning my designs on square paper, and I highly recommend you do the same. It's very easy to plan stitch by stitch, and then it's very easy to keep track of it once you want to knit it. We all know that Intarsia is quite time consuming, and I'm going to show you what you can do to test a specific pattern without using the Intarsia carriage. And this works for simpler shapes. Just so you know, the machine I'm using is a Brother KH891. You can see here I've got one yarn in feather A, and I just knitted a few rows. And now I could just place a second yarn in feather B. I'm going to press my MC button, which stands for multicolor. We use this button when we want to use two-color punch card, for example. And once I press my MC button, I will push needles out. And what's going to happen? All the needles will knit with yarn in feather A, and then just that one needle that I pushed out will knit with the yarn in feather B. And I can continue like that. I can look at my square paper and just read my chart just like I would normally do when I would knit Intarsia. And I know we will get these long floats, but I think it's still good enough, and just test my design, see how I feel about the heart, and then I can develop it further. You can see here how I can already get an idea of how my little hearts will look in two colors, even though I have the floats in the back. Obviously this wouldn't work if you wanted to knit a garment. You can see here how I've got these holes, but this is good enough for me to get an idea of how my shape would look once knitted in two colors. And then once I have it like that, I can decide if I want to add any stitches anywhere or develop it further in any other way. This one, for example, I can tell already that I would like to add another stitch in this section here, as this side here looks a bit too bulky. So I'm going to show you how I'm going to draw that on square paper. So this is the initial heart. And right here I had 1, 2, 3 stitches, and I think I'm just going to add another one, and we'll continue like that all the way to here, I think. The difference is not very massive. All I did was adding another stitch in this section here, so you can see how I've got here 1, 2, 3 stitches. Now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I like this section here. I think that's pretty alright. So another thing that I did was right here, you can see how the straight section here starts at the same time. For this one, I started 1 row earlier. These are all little adjustments that I think will make this look a bit better. But let's just see once we knit it how that will look. I'm going to use my color pencils to mark this area so I can follow this chart a bit easier. And now I can just write on my chart, color 1, color 2, and then color 3. They don't have to be the same colors you're going to actually knit with, but this is quite useful for you to keep track. Color 1 is orange, color 2 is purple, and then color 3 is my background. I'm just going to leave that white. There's no point drawing as long as I can keep track of these stitches using the purple and the orange. Here's the second sample I knitted using my Intarsia carriage, and definitely having that extra stitch here makes the heart a bit better proportioned, and I'm really happy with it. Here are the two samples next to each other, and I think we can all agree that the one done with the Intarsia carriage looks much better. Here's a photo with the chart in case you want to try this for yourself. If you have a double bed and you are knitting Intarsia, obviously you don't want to leave the ribbon bed uncovered as your yarn might catch into the pegs. So you can either use the cover, this one came with my ribbon bed when I bought it, or you can just place an old sample or a fabric or a towel over the ribbon bed so you don't have any issues. So here's my carriage for my brother. And these things here, this one, I can't actually use this on my machine as this will serve as a row counter tripper for other models. So I'm just going to leave this here. I'm not sure for which machines this will be used, but I know that for mine it just doesn't do anything. And this one, I can actually take that out, and you can see how I've got 2 holes where I can place it. And if I place it in this hole up here, the only thing it's going to do is going to trip the row counter. But if I place it in this one here, it's going to trip the row counter, but also the knit leader, which I actually never use on my machine. So I'm just going to place it in this one here, just so I can keep track of my rows when I knit across. To place the carriage on the machine is very simple. All you have to do is just to slide it like that. And how you will know if it's in the correct position, if you try to pull it up, it just wouldn't come off. When knitting Intarsia, your cones of yarn or your wrappings of yarn will stay on the floor in front of you. They're not going through the yarn tension unit. And you've got these little things that usually come with your Intarsia carriage. These things are called sinkers, and they serve as little weights for your yarn when you're knitting with the Intarsia carriage. Some people prefer to not use these and just prefer to hold their tension with their hands, so you can try for yourself and see what you prefer. If you do want to use your sinkers, all you have to do is to kind of sew the yarn through these little holes, and depending on the thickness of the yarn, you will choose in which holes you will go and also how many times you go in them. Usually there is a little needle that is bent that is very useful to do this, but I lost mine. And at the end goes through here and comes out at the top. How you know if the tension will be alright is if you hold them like that and the sinker doesn't just slide off, because you don't want it to just slide off and fall on the floor when you're knitting. That will just make everything get tangled. And also you don't want to feel too much resistance when you pull the yarn through. I think this should be fine, but I will only know once I start knitting. And these are all things you have to check once you knit your sample and then decide what works best. And before reading the actual chart, I'm just going to show you how to do 2-color Intarsia. I'm just going to do half-half using these 2 colors. You can see that I already knitted a few rows with waste yarn. Now your main carriage will actually come off the machine. And for the first row, all I have to do is to bring the needles in the correct position, and that means in D position for my brother. It will probably depend on the type of machine you are using. And to bring the needles in D position, all I have to do is to knit across. You can do it from either side, it doesn't really matter. The only thing that happened is needle came forward and all the latches are open. And this is a very important thing to remember. The latches always have to stay open. If a latch is closed, then that stitch will drop. Just going to do half in the darker pink and half in the lighter pink, just so you can see how you actually lay your yarn on top of the hooks. Your Intarsia carriage can be either side, but the only thing you have to remember when you do your first row is that the tail or the end of the yarn will be on the side where the carriage is. You're kind of laying your yarn on top of the needles away from the carriage. This could be a bit tricky. You can always wrap your yarn around your machine, or you can just hold it like that. I'm kind of using the sinker to lay the yarn on top of the hooks, just like so. And you can see how the sinker stays here and holds a bit of tension. When you're laying your second yarn, I'm holding both my ends with one hand, and I'm just going to lay the yarn on top, like so. I'm just going to push the yarn a little bit so it's a bit further back on the hooks, and we'll knit across. On the first row, you can see that we're kind of getting a little hole right there, and in order to avoid that, what we could do, I'm going to bring the needles a bit forward, cross the yarns like that, so you can see how I went behind this yarn. I will E-wrap, just for about 5 stitches. I'll push the needles back in D position. And now I'm ready to lay the yarns for the second row. This part here is very important. In order to not get a hole where the two colors are meeting, all you have to do is, once I laid one yarn up to the point where my color will finish, the other color, I can kind of just go underneath it. We're crossing the yarns at the point where the two colors are meeting. I will just hold this little tail while I go across. And I could just snap this now. It's quite difficult to verbally describe this, so I'm just going to knit a few rows. You can see now why Intarsia is such a time-consuming technique, because you have to literally lay your yarn on top of your needles every single row. So this is how you do a straight line, but for example, you could always do an angle, so you can have more of the darker pink. And you can see here how this is the last stitch where we have the darker pink, and here's the stitch where we have the lighter pink. They are like that, and I just go under with the darker pink. And now for the next row, on this stitch, we will have the darker pink. I will repeat that one more time, but of course you could do that every single row. And this time I want to go one stitch further. And we are ready now to knit this sample, and we're going to read this chart. Just a few things to touch on before we are starting knitting. Just in case you never read a chart, I already marked my center of the sample, and in total I have to cast on 40 stitches. But of course, if you were not sure, you could always just count the stitches. And the rule is that every single square will mark one stitch horizontally and one row vertically. So if I wanted to count this and to know how many stitches I have, all I have to do is to count them horizontally like that. And if I want to know how many rows, I can just count them vertically. So I could do 1, 2, 3. Every single square is going to be one row. Here you can see how I also wrote instructions about colors. And I left everything in white, as there's no point for me coloring this in because I only have 2 colors. And I know that color 1 is all that I left in white. So all the squares are in white. And color 2 is what I've drawn in purple. We have to remember that on every single row, even though we have the same color on one row, it's actually going to have to be 2 cones. So for example, on row 10, I have to have 1 cone or 1 winding of color 1, then 1 cone of color 2, and then another cone of color 1. So looking at the chart, we know that we have to cast on 40 stitches, which I already have. And in total, we're going to knit 21 rows. I will just put my row counter to 0. And just like I mentioned before, I have just knitted a few rows in waste yarn. And now if I want to knit with my main yarn, I can just push the needles out and e-wrap my main yarn. And I will just knit 2 rows with my main carriage. You can see that I already placed my yarns on the floor, and what I did was I chose color 2, which is here marked in purple, to be the darker pink, and color 1, which is all the white, will be in the light pink, so that's going to be the background of my design. And I already placed them in the order of the pattern on my square paper. Just like before, we're going to place the Intarsia carriage on the machine, and we'll knit across to bring the needles in D position. All the latches are open, I'm ready to start laying my yarn on the hooks. And now I can use my chart to guide me, so I can know on how many stitches I need to place color 1, how many color 2, and then again on how many color 1, because this is a more simple design and I know that my argyle is placed right in the middle of my sample. I can just guide myself off the center of my machine. But if I didn't have that and I had multiple repeats, or my design would be placed not in the center of my panel, I could always just use my square paper and count how many stitches up to the point where I need to add color 2. Here is the center, and I know that on these 2 needles in the very center I have to lay the darker pink or color 2. So I can just lay color 1 up to that point, and then color 2. Remember, the tail will stay to the side where the carriage is. So I placed it on the 2 center needles. And place color 1 on the rest of the needles. Just like so. We'll knit across. just like I showed you before, in order to avoid having those little holes, we could erupt some of the tails. Here is a bit of a tricky one because color 2 is only on 2 needles, so we don't really have enough stitches to erupt this tail on. So I'll just do this one. Push needles out, and I'm kind of crossing these 2 yarns. I could erupt this one on top of the pink, but I'm worried that it will then be visible on the right side, so I will just weave it in at the end. We'll just push these needles back in deep position. So that was row 2, and now we are on row 3. I don't have to increase just yet, so I will just do the same again. Once I finish the sample, I can just take this end and weave it in so I don't get that hole anymore. We're able now to snap this tail and get rid of it. The idea is that less ends to tie in at the end, the better, so you can find ways to do that for yourself. This is just how I think you can do it. We are now on row 4, and you can see that color 2 is over 4 needles now, not 2 like before, so we have to increase 1 either side. Here was the last needle with color 2 before, and now I'm moving 1 needle further. For row 5, we have to repeat the same as row 4. Color 2 is over 4 needles. For row 6, color 2 is over 6 needles, so we have to increase 2 more. And you can see how we will do that all the way up to row 10, and then after row 12, we will start decreasing. We are now on row 12, and you can see that we are starting to decrease. And I'm now on row 18, where again I have color 2 over only 2 needles, just like we had at the very beginning. I finished the argyle now, so I can snap the yarn. And like I did before, I'm going to e-wrap one of the tails. I'm making sure that all the latches are open. From now on, you're able to start knitting with your normal carriage. And here's the little argyle. It's pretty perfect except that little hole right there. But like I mentioned before, I could always just use either a latch tool or a needle to weave this in. I can just grab it like that and go over the darker pink so it's not visible on the right side. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've learned a couple of things from this video. Don't forget to subscribe and I'll see you in my next video.